Welcome back. Well, as you can see, I'm charging up some cases here. Very soon they'll be ready to seat bullets, and I'll be able to get out shooting with my anticipated rifle that should be showing up sometime tomorrow. Just got to get the scope mounted on it and I'll be ready to go. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm not up to speed with some of the most digital equipment on the market, and I'm still using this old antique, I guess you could say an antique measure. Well, yes, it is. It is old and probably antique. If it were a car, it certainly would be antique. I bought this in 1972. And also I bought this Lyman made by O-House 505 balance beam scale in 1972. They've been serving me very, very well throughout the years. As a matter of fact, with absolute precision. Now you might say, well, I've seen these and they just don't turn out very, very accurate loads. I have an answer to that for you because I think there's some unfortunately little known information out there that can make your measure work a lot better than it may be working. So we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about also the different types of scales and even the automated, digitized, computerized trickling scales that boast, greater efficiency, better speed, more uniformity, and all that stuff. Of course, they're not cheap. We're talking hundreds of dollars in some cases. So let's get at it. I'm going to review the measuring device, balance beam scale, and digital scales. Digital scales are great, but I'm going to review what I consider to be actually a benefit of the balance beam scale over all the other types. And we're going to talk about just how to set this up, also to various methods of charging cases so that you can have different accuracy results with different powders that are more demanding. And also, finally, we're going to go into what the accuracy results are in reality for different types of error. In other words, if you have a couple of tenths of a grain error throwing powders, bulky powders in this type of measure, what does that result in downrange? I've done some actual tabulations based on velocity charts, from the Hornady ballistic calculator, and I put together some numbers based on the actual error of throwing charges. So let's get at it. Let's begin by talking about the most crucial part of the measuring operation, and that is an accurate scale. Now, either way, a digital scale or a balance beam scale has more than enough accuracy in order to get the job done. But before we just dismiss a balance beam scale, let me talk about its accuracy. This scale right here relies on the simple physics of gravity. In other words, the balance beam is as ancient as history itself. When this fulcrum, which is a sharp knife ground edge balancing on agate stones, which are precision, there's absolutely no friction whatsoever. When this zeroes out to zero, its repeatability is unerring. It simply will return to zero every time, unless the actual weight changes, and it will record that with great precision. In other words, it doesn't have a sensitivity of plus or minus a tenth of a grain, as a lot of digital scales do. Now, a tenth of a grain sensitivity sounds like it's pretty accurate. I'll show you the repeatability of this scale. First of all, I've got a 200 grain nozzle petition bullet in this scale, and I'm just gonna throw that in the pan and weigh it up. It's also a test of the precision of nozzlers' bullets. Bingo, it comes to exactly zero. Now, if I lift this pan up and put it back down, it should, if it has good repeatability, in other words, no sensitivity, it should return to zero each time, which it did that time. I can lift it up, put it back down. Its repeatability is, you could do this all day long, and it's always going to return to zero. When that is on the zero, there is absolutely no error whatsoever. There's no tenth of a grain error up or down. Now, What is a tenth of a grain error plus or minus, which is very frequently advertised in literature online? All the catalog literature will say it's plus or minus. So here we have a charge X, and here we have a charge of, we'll say that charge is 30 grains of powder. Now we have a minus of a tenth of a grain, and here we have a plus of a tenth of a grain. What we actually have is a 3/10 of a grain variation from one load to another. It doesn't sound like that when you say plus or minus a tenth of a grain, but that's exactly what we have. Here's the desired target charge, and here's a plus grain, a tenth of a grain, and here's a minus a tenth of a grain. So you have a charge of 30 grains, you have a charge of 30.1 grains, and a charge of 29.9 grains. That's the degree of error that many digital scales will produce, including some of the most expensive scales that cost into the hundreds of dollars. That's the guaranteed accuracy that they will produce. All right, let's take a close look at this RCBS powder measure and see what makes it tick. Now a measure has three principal components. You've got the powder reservoir, you've got the measuring drum, and you've got a plug and a spindle which controls the depth of that drum and the volume. So let's take apart the device and look inside. This is your wiping area. This is where the powder comes down from the reservoir, and it must be cut off by this surface. And this is the discharge end of it right here, and this goes down, and typically you'll have 2 or 3 different size dispensing orifices, and these should match most closely the case that you're charging, and it should be as the largest you can use for the case diameter that you have. They just simply allow the case to pop right up against it, or you can charge directly into your measuring pan. The charge drum, and this is the threaded side where the plug goes in, the measuring spindle, and this is the charge hole that goes by the top surface that cuts it off. These surfaces are knife edge, so that they will in fact cut off powder. Now this has been rotated and rotated. It could be very well a couple of million times, and you can see there's no wear on it whatsoever. These things are so durable, it's amazing. It also has this one here has got 3 holes. You can change this from a left-hand operation to right-hand operation. You can also control which way the handle is mounted and whether it's mounted toward the center or give you greater leverage. So you can accommodate it any way you want. And here's the spindle. Now you can get, this is a very simple spindle, and this spindle right here shows marked graduations. Some people dismiss these as being, rather crude, but they're not, in fact. This works exactly like a micrometer spindle. All micrometer spindles that have a vernier scale shroud on the outside with, lacquered black with white numerals and markings, it has a spindle exactly the same inside it. This one's not as sophisticated, but it can be used with almost the same degree of precision. You're not measuring thousandths of an inch on a piece of steel. I found that typically a turn of an eighth of a turn will give you whatever precise measure you need for the smallest granules of powder, and that can easily be. You can record these settings by this is the locking collar right here. You can simply take a measurement from the locking collar size and note the graduation. The larger marking will have a numbered graduation. So if it happens to be at the number, and this one here happens to be at the number 5, you can simply measure There are 4 graduations between the major graduations. So, and those graduations are the threads themselves. So in other words, you can have a graduation of 4 and then 0.5, which would mean 2 turns of the 4, and then you can set it, you can mark in your journal that plus an eighth or plus a quarter or whatever it is to give you a return to accuracy. So, you know, the micrometer spindles are great, but you know, you don't have to spend that extra money in order to get the same degree of accuracy. All you need to do is just simply record it in your journal the same way that you would have to do it with the micrometer. This is key. This diameter hole right here, this is called the small capacity drum. Trust me, get the small capacity drum if you're interested in accuracy. The small capacity drum will give you very, very fine accuracy. The large capacity drum is the one that typically comes standard with the unit, and it means that you have to go out and buy the small capacity drum in order to get the kind of accuracy that you should be able to expect. But are you getting enough powder into this drum? This one happens to charge 65 to 67 grains of any kind of powder I put in it. That accommodates cartridges all the way up through all the 3006 charges that you can deliver, and even to some 7mm Remington Magnum cases. So it's not by any means small. It's what I would call that a standard size drum. The other one that they call standard size drum, I would classify as a Magnum size drum. When you have a small wiping area, you might call it a smaller amount of square inch surface to cut. That translates to a much finer degree of accuracy. Ball powders with this measure, I can charge sometimes with virtual perfect accuracy. Some powders will charge within about 2 or 3 tenths of a grain, which I'll talk about that. In some cases, it doesn't make a bit of difference in terms of accuracy, and I'll explain. I'll go over the results that I showed. But in any case, it throws them very, very quickly. And if I need to make fine adjustments, I can certainly throw light charges and then go to my scale and then trickle them up. We'll talk about that process. Now, the way I've cared for this drum through the years is very simple. Every now and then, I remove it from the measure, and I just inspect it, make sure it's got no rust on it, which, as you can see, is still perfectly blued. Then I wipe it off, and then I wipe my gun rag, my lightly oiled flannel rag on it, and afterwards that applies a light coating of protective oil to that bluing. Then I take a clean rag, absolutely clean cloth, and I wipe off all that oil. What I'll have is a blued surface that will remain blued and stay in good condition. This is, like I say, this has been in my basement now for over 15 years, and it was in a basically house environment for the remainder of the years. It goes back to 1972, and it's in pristine condition. So that was my care of it through the years. You want to just make sure that you get all traces of oil off, but by wiping that a little bit of oil on, it removes any fingerprints that you've applied by handling it, and it ensures that it will give you good long service forevermore. And do the same thing with your plug. Just wipe that off. Make sure that this face is clean, and that fits precisely into the bore of that drum. And with the measure, just simply wipe the inside occasionally. And that's all there is to it. Be careful not to get any oils or anything like that inside this. Now, the thing that keeps this lubricated is the powder itself. Smokeless powder contains graphite, and that graphite will keep this instrument working in good shape. So without touching the blued portion, just simply insert it carefully without twisting, so that you don't want to scar those surfaces. Return the plug to the threaded side. You do not want to use any oils here, because that'll cause no end of problems for your powder. Your powder will stick to it. and snug it down with a judicious turn. You don't want to over tighten. With a new measure or a freshly cleaned measure, I recommend that you fill the reservoir with your smokeless powder. Never ever ever use black powder in these. You'll blow your house up. You want to take your container and just simply run one full reservoir through the measure, and that will ensure that any traces of oil are removed, and it will also lubricate that drum with the graphite in the powder. A little bit about the manner of operation. You should always fill the drum, complete your charge in the up position. The drum, the spindle is facing down and the drum is facing upward to fill for the next case. That's how you finish. Drop your charge and then return it, and you're ready to go for the next case. If you do it in that way all the time, you'll have consistent charges. The other thing is to use a consistent down, up, down, up. And if you use that particular speed, you'll make sure that you're dropping your entire charge. Check your cases, weigh them, and determine what your degree of accuracy is with different powders. That can range the full gamut from having extremely accurate charges. If I set this to pistol size cases and I charge flake powders or small ball powders and things like that, which are used for pistol cases, it's really, charges within the 1/10 of a grain always, never with any error whatsoever. If I'm charging heavy bulk powders such as IMR 4064, H4831, things like that, those are like miniature logs. Those can sometimes hang up a little bit, and you can feel the drum cutting those powders coarsely. But you'll be very surprised that the charges will come out quite uniformly. If you feel that it's an unusually heavy stick where it really hangs up, just simply drop it back into the hopper. Now, I'll go about the business of different ways you can ensure a greater degree of accuracy. Now, whether you're using a balance beam scale like this or a digital scale, I'll show you the process of setting up your powder measure so that you can accurately dispense charges without too much delay. First of all, you want to make sure that your scale is zeroed. If you're using a digital scale, you want to use your test weight, your check weight, to be sure that you've set it and it's calibrated correctly. Now, make sure that your knife edge, if you're using a balance beam scale, check to make sure that your knife blade is centered between the end posts so that it doesn't cause any friction. With your weights, I'm setting it to 47.5 grains. So I simply move this large beam weight over to 45, plus on this right hand side I set it to 2.5. That gives me 2.5 plus 45 is 47.5 grains. This side measuring 5 grains per increment, and this side over here measuring 1/10 of a grain per increment. And your scale could certainly vary, so make sure you check with the manufacturer's directions. Now, once I've done that, I want to fill my pan and bring it to balance. Or in the case of a digital scale, just simply fill it until you get up to your whatever desired weight. I'm looking for 47.5 grains here. I happen to be using a powder which is quite coarse. Now, right here, it's not balanced. It's swinging a little bit high, but that's fine because I can take a little bit of that out. This is not the precision part of the process. All I'm looking to do is get a rough idea of the bulk necessary to fill up my drum. Once I've done that, I'm near to a zero. Drop it into the empty reservoir with the drum hole facing upward. Drop it in. What I want to do now is look down inside and be very sure that that hole is capturing every granule. Make sure that the drum is facing sideways. So I've got the back wall of this measure here is capturing the powder. Gently, you don't want to turn it forcibly, but gently close that reservoir hole until the powder is captured and you filled up that reservoir. And that's all there is to it. Once that drum is filled to capacity, gently, then pour your powder in nearly to the top. I like to bring it to within about a ½ inch of the top. Keep your powder container on the bench so that you know that you're always using that powder. We'll throw 2 or 3 charges into the pan just to settle the powder. It's always a good idea when you first load it. Put this on the scale and see how close it is. Right now it's measuring light. Some powders, certain ball powders, you can almost guarantee it's going to come up to 0 the first time because they compress nicely and uniformly. This one here tends to be a loose granule powder. So we're going to open that up I'll open it up by a good ½ turn. But by doing it that way, by filling up the reservoir first from the pan, we went a little bit far, we'll bring it halfway back. This should be about right. Now, there are two different methods of charging cases. You can charge cases directly by using the averaging method, where the beam will balance both above and below and on center with about equal regularity. That's a good averaging method, and that works fine. When it's doing that, you can just simply go right along one case after another and charge them directly. The other method, if you wish to deal with powders which are more bulky and tend to have greater degrees of error, is to use the trickle up method. The trickle up method is simple. Just drop a few charges of powder into your powder trickler. For some reason, powder tricklers seem to be they're left in the last pages of a lot of catalogs. I wonder why. They don't want you to know that you can trickle up your charges and get them very precise. I think that's my guess. They always want to encourage you to spend more money on things, thinking that you can't do it efficiently this way. Now, these tricklers work, like a concrete truck does. It has a screw inside, and the powder simply follows along that screw and dispenses it. So I can trickle up my charges by throwing a slightly light charge. That one there happened to come out very, very slightly light, and I can bring it up. It takes no time at all. Let's see how long it would take me to do 10 cases. We'll start it up. That's 1. That's 2. That's 3. That's 4. Five. 6. 7. 8. 9. And the last one, 10. Okay, you can run that back and you can put a stopwatch to it and see how long it took me to do those loads. Maybe I'll do that before I post this video. Now I want to give you an idea of how this works out in relation to some of the automated units that this is charging. When I was doing that, I was charging right dead zero. In other words, plus or minus absolutely nothing. There was absolutely spot on without any error whatsoever. Now, how does that compare, for instance, to some of the digitized, mechanized scales with dribble the cases in? Well, I was just watching a manufacturer's video, and he dispensed 30 grains of powder. 30 grains is a very small charge. I mean, it's about the size of a charge you might put in a 6.5 Creedmoor, so it's a viable charge, but it's very small. I'm charging 47.5 grains here. It wouldn't make any difference if they was dumping 65 grains because it's the same clunk, clunk, clunk. It makes no difference how big the charge is. It's going to take the same amount of time whether I'm charging 1.5 grains or if I'm charging, 65.5 grains. So speed has nothing to do with it with this system. But with the automated trickling system where it dispenses it from a mechanized, computerized, homogenized machine, that takes 14 seconds. I timed it. It took 14 seconds to deliver a 30 grain charge. Now 14 seconds is an awful long time. I haven't turned back the clock yet to see how long it took me to do one of these charges, but I don't think it was 14 seconds. Even if whatever it was, I could do any number of charges regardless of the charge weight with this system. Now so is it quicker? Well, I dispute that it would be quicker. Is it more accurate? Absolutely not. This is dead, right to the zero accuracy. Their claimed accuracy is plus or minus a tenth, which I said shows a potential for a 3/10 variation because of the sensitivity of the computer chip. Okay, let's finish it up and take a look at some numbers for downrange performance if you have errors in your charge. Okay, now for illustration purposes, I turned to the 6.5 Creedmoor page, and this is an equal opportunity channel, so even though I don't own a 6.5 Creedmoor, it's a very popular cartridge, so I'm going to use that one to demonstrate. I'll go down here to Hausen Varget powder, which is a popular powder used in many cartridges, and it has a starting charge of 32 grains for a velocity of 2371, average velocity that is, and an average velocity of 2598 with a charge of 35.8 grains. When I say average velocity, powders do not produce exact velocities with given powder charges. They only produce average velocities, some with greater degree of accuracy than others. Now, what I did with those velocities, my goal was to ascertain what the spread was between the lowest and the highest for velocity and the charge spread. So the velocity spread was 227 feet per second, and the charge spread between those two was 3.8 grains. From that, after I plugged that into my calculator, it came up to a foot per second change per grain of 60 feet per second. That's easily divided by 10 for a tenth of a grain, which comes out to an average of 6 feet per second per tenth of a grain error. So if you have a target charge, what I did was, now I move this out of the way so it doesn't read through the book. I took all these numbers directly from the Hornady ballistic calculator and copied them directly onto my spreadsheet. I rounded off the highest velocity of 2598 to 2600 feet per second. That's just for clarity. 2 feet per second up. I bumped it up to 2600 feet per second average velocity. And what I did was I added a 6 foot per second error. That would represent a tenth of a grain variation. Now, that tenth of a grain variation is a constant. So in other words, 2/10 would simply be double that, and 3/10 would triple it, and so forth. up to whatever error you happen to have in your powder measure and the powder that you're dispensing. So you can easily determine what the error is with your particular powder measure by weighing it on the scale, and you can compute these same sorts of figures. As you can see, it produces, I used a zero of 100 yards. That's right here. I used a zero of 100. You can use whatever zero you want, but I wanted to see what the actual drop beyond 100 yards was and how it changes by having a tenth of a grain error. Incremental errors out to 200 yards, there was none recorded. I'll show you back up here. There was no error recorded whatsoever. So out to 200 yards, we have right here minus 4.2 inches. This is not MOA, this is inches. Minus 4.2 inches. There is absolutely no difference out to 200 yards. Error at 300 yards, we pick up an error of a tenth of an inch. At 400 yards, it remains an error of a tenth of an inch. I suppose those are on the outside of the envelope of each tenth. And at 500 yards, we have an error of 3/10 of an inch. You can read it yourself. You can determine for yourself whether or not a tenth of a grain of dispenser accuracy is something to worry about. I think even if I were a 500 yard, 600 yard target shooter, I certainly would be concerned about 4/10 of an inch. There's far more to concern yourself with than a couple of tenths of an inch at that range. You have mirage and all sorts of things that can put you off target by many inches, let alone a tenth of an inch. Well, anyway, I'll leave that up to you. Again, you can multiply these errors by whatever you want. You can multiply it by 5 for a half a grain of error. That's an extreme amount of error that I very, very rarely see in my dispenser. But a half a grain of error at 500 yards would give me 15/10 of an inch. That's an inch and a half error at 500 yards. I hardly think that that's going to concern me. It might concern you. So that's why I virtually all the time use straight from the powder measure, and I don't worry about weighing out each charge. So there you have it. That's the story about the powder measure and the scale, whether you're using a digital scale or a balance beam scale. And I frankly, I would go out and buy a balance beam scale tomorrow. It's the same thing. I would not go digital. Digital scales do have a certain benefit. If I wanted to weigh bullets and things like that, they have that. This is hard to put certain types of items in. But for checking the accuracy of anything, there's nothing that beats a good balance beam scale that has good repeatability. That's the key, is repeatability. Not all balance beam scales are created equal. This one here, produced by O-House, has got extremely fine accuracy that's right on the button every single time. But even still, regardless of what you're using, know how to clean up your dispenser every now and then and keep it running. Make sure that you get yourself a small diameter drum and get away from that large diameter drum, because they just simply can't produce that sort of accuracy with each charge. And don't think that the small diameter drum is for pistol cartridges. Not by any means. 50 grains, even if RCBS has changed it to only 50 grains, 50 grains is a big charge. And if you're charging larger cases, you just simply half the charge and then do a double charge. So if I was doing a 60 grain charge with a 50 grain drum, I'd just simply divide the charge to 2, so I'd have 2 30 grain charges, dump them, boom, boom, and there you go. And I show you how those inaccuracies may not be as compelling as some people tend to believe they are. I often, for many, many years, I concerned myself about whether or not this beam was swinging a little bit when I was charging right directly from the dispenser. Now, knowing what I've seen with that, I know now that it has no bearing on it whatsoever. Just so you know, last summer I did a shooting demonstration with my 257 Roberts, the Model 70 featherweight, and I was using strictly dropped charges with this dispenser. I did not bring them up with a trickler, and that was with H4831 powder, which is very, very coarse. It's like dispensing little logs. It cuts off every single time. And that was producing very, very fine accuracy at 100 yards, and it would still produce very fine accuracy out to 1,000 yards. Because, you know, a 3/8 of an inch group only is multiplied times 10 out to 1,000 yards. So remember that. It's not as big a deal as a lot of people concern themselves with. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Benny sends his regards. He's just doing absolutely great. Thanks for watching. God bless.